in a real-life conference to be doing some sort of practical hands-on work to help people look at the new toolkit. Instead, we have had Alan very nobly do a huge amount of work for us to put together this presentation on how to use an application profile to do real cataloguing. I will now hand over to him and let him explain exactly what he has been cataloguing and show to us. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, this is a case of being overambitious. It was suggested that I think at one of the last orientation days that we should not do another example of a book for our hands-on work, and then somebody suggested, why not a sound recording? So, as we don't actually catalogue any of our sound recordings using Mark 21 or RDA at the moment, that's a bit of a challenge, but anyway, I have attempted to rise to it with the help of the True Echoes project at the British Library, which has been working on, amongst others, the Malinowski collection, which I'll say a bit about in a moment. But just to get started, this one sentence description of RDA becoming quite familiar, I expect. But what I wanted to draw attention to was the second paragraph. I'm cataloguing the Malinowski collection, well, part of it at least. And yeah, so I just got to the point where I was talking about the introduction to and this description of RDA. The second paragraph, at the end of the sentence, it points out that the toolkit is being developed for a global user community, and it has to be, and it should be used in conjunction with community policies, application profiles, and workflows. And that's what I'm hopefully going to illustrate this morning. So here are the caveats, if you like. Little of what I'm talking about exists in the toolkit already. Obviously 3R is not ready for implementation because these things don't exist yet. Community documentation is in development. There's inevitably everyone's preparations are being disrupted for everything by COVID-19, so hardly the only people affected by this. And I'm not sure there's going to be time to cover every element in the description, so I'm really focusing on things that are going to come up in everyday cataloguing and things that should be of interest. And this is not training, this is awareness or orientation. So I'm going to illustrate how we might use the RDA toolkit in conjunction with community profiles, application profiles, and workflows. This is really an application of RDA for implementation scenario C, which would be a bibliographic authority data record structure within an ILS, library management system. And I'm going to be using Mark 21 as my schema because that's what is most widely used in the UK. And hopefully this session will illustrate how these things can work together to enable you to catalogue efficiently. So I'm obviously going to use the RDA toolkit. There's lots of reference to instructions in the toolkit on the forthcoming slides. I'm going to be using Mark 21. As I mentioned, I've received a lot of help from colleagues on the True Echoes project who are cataloguing in conjunction with communities in the South Pacific, a set of wax cylinders from including the Malinowski collection. These wax cylinders contain anthropological recordings, etc., cultural information from those communities in the South Seas, recorded in the early 20th century. And those are the 5 cylinders of the Malinowski collection. But I'm only going to do one of them because I haven't got time to do all 5. So I think some of this will be familiar from the previous presentation. So I won't spend as much time on it as I did in the previous presentation. So those of you who attended the previous presentation will have just seen this illustration of what an application profile might look like. This would be the RDA components, which might be derived from the RDA registry or toolkit ultimately, which set out basically the attributes of the different metadata elements within RDA, including domain range, whether there's a vocabulary scheme associated with them, and the types of instructions, the types of recording methods that can be used with that particular element. And then to turn this into a local or community-based profile, you would need to add in information specific to your community. And so I've done that here. I've put in the recording method that the British Library, for example, would choose to use. I've put in the transcription methods that the British Library would generally choose to use. I've recorded our appropriate vocabulary encoding schemes and string encoding schemes, which essentially mark 21 in this instance. And there's a mapping to mark, and there's status, whether we require the element or whether the element is optional. And then I've made a link to a template, which is my assumption that it will be useful to have a generic template effectively, which will contain the elements that are commonly required for a description, and then there'll be other ones that are more specific to particular types of resource, whether they're published or unpublished, audio or text or whatever they happen to be. So, yeah, so that was me forgetting about my animations again. I'll try and remember them. So the input sheet I'm using is going to look a bit like this, but there isn't room on the screen to put everything. So it'll only be the rows pertinent to the specific element that are displayed until we get to the very end. I mentioned a bit about workflows earlier on, so I'm just going to quickly go through this slide. The application profile underpins the workflow, but the workflow provides a narrative for cataloguers to follow through for the type of resource that they're cataloguing. And then there'll be a link between the instructions and other sources of information from the workflow to the toolkit, effectively. And of course, workflows don't. The workflows that currently exist will have to be rewritten to align them with 3R, and that is work that will be getting underway, hopefully quite soon. So, and really this presentation is part of my development process and thinking about how we're going to do this. So feedback on what you think of this will be useful to help me refine it. So I'm starting out from a sort of high level of thinking, well, what is the sequence that we're going to go through? So we're going to have a pre-cataloguing sequence when we've got something that we need to catalogue, but we haven't decided what to do with it yet, or even what it is necessarily. So there are basic questions that need to be answered. Then we get to the point where we're describing the thing that we've got using the resource itself, or maybe other sources of information. Then we will be in a position to start relating it to other things and thinking, how do we put this into context, both in the context of our own collection and maybe in the wider universe of human discourse. And then we ought to actually review our description, decide whether it's accurate, complete, coherent, and well-formed, as Gordon was saying. So one of the things about the toolkit is it's difficult to know where to start. So it's generally a good idea to start with the item in hand. It's not always necessary, but it's usually a good idea. And if we're working in Mark, we're probably going to start with a bibliographic description. You need to think about whether you're going to need new authority records, because that might influence the order in which you do things. Always a good idea to see if somebody else has already done it for you and you don't have to do anything. So that's something that we'll remind people of. And of course, RDA is designed to encourage reuse of metadata, this modular structure of the WEMI stack, if you like, encourage you to reuse information. So what am I describing? And there's some questions that we can ask that will drive people in a particular direction in the toolkit. So a good question to ask is, does this manifestation have more than one expression in it? If so, then there will be guidance on how to catalog aggregates, and we'll have a specific workflow documentation relating to aggregates, which will tell you about the different types of aggregate, etc. Have I got a multi-part or a single unit? There's guidance again on that, on mode of issuance. Maybe it's a serial or an integrating resource. There's guidance on diachronic works. There's an extension plan, element which is important in this context, and deciding whether you've got a serial or integrating resource or a static resource, static work rather. And then there are workflows, or there will be workflows for cataloging diachronic works, just as we've currently got workflows for serials and for multipart. And if it's not a diachronic work, then it must be a static work. So, having gone through that kind of process, I probably know by that point that what I'm about to catalogue from the Malinowski collection is an aggregate. It's a static work, it's a sound recording, and it's audio. In fact, I probably knew some of those things as soon as I picked it up. But, and that will then guide me to choosing an appropriate template from in my ILS or whatever my input mechanism is. And I'm sure we can provide some guidance on how to decide which would be the input form, but I imagine that within existing implementations and existing systems, people will know that. And then I need to think about my sources of information before I start actually cataloguing anything. So RDA provides guidance on recording sources of metadata and what are the appropriate sources to use in different contexts. And there is actually a vocabulary encoding scheme that allows you to express what those sources are. So what I am actually going to use as my source of information is cylinder number 3 from the Malinowski collection, because that's the thing that I'm chosen to catalogue. And there is some information on the container, as you can see. This is clearly an unpublished item, but the blue crayon, which is quite difficult to read, is actually information that was written by Malinowski himself about what's actually on the cylinders. So We have some other information. Obviously, if we take the cylinder out of the box, we can see that it's a black wax cylinder, which would be played on a phonograph. We know from having, well, I haven't listened to it, but I know that my colleagues in Sound and Vision at the British Library have listened to the content. We know it's an unaccompanied male vocals and singing, and we know from that they were recorded in 1918. In fact, one of the cylinders actually has a date on it. This one doesn't. And we know that the duration is 2 minutes and 8 seconds. That's for both recordings that are on this cylinder. And we know that it's not a perfect recording. And we know that it's designated as cylinder 3 in the collection. There's also additional information that I've had from researchers who are currently working on the True Echoes project. And I'm not going to go through that in detail. Some of it will come up later on as we go through the presentation. So that's the kind of pre-cataloguing process that I'm envisaging that people will go through. But then we'll get to the point where we've actually got to start recording information. So, as I said, we're going to use a template for this, but because of the limitations of PowerPoint or my imagination, we're going to have to do it in a slightly clunky way. So I'll be putting up selections of instructions from RDA. I'll be incorporating where appropriate BL policy information, and I'll put up sections of the input form, which include bits of the application profile. And we'll see how we do for time. It may be that we can't go through all the elements that I've done, that I've covered, but they will be in, the slides will be made available later on, which will also have my notes on them. I haven't had time to actually, I'm quite disappointed that I didn't have time to do authority records, but I just didn't have time to incorporate them, so apologies for that. But I will mention them where relevant. So, we're going to start with the title of manifestation. So there's a definition and scope in the RDA toolkit. I hope people can read that. If you're doing it on a mobile phone, it might be hard. A nomen that is an appellation of manifestation in natural language and phrasing used in common discourse. So essentially it's what people call whatever the resource is. RDA has its own pre-recording guidance. So it tells you that a manifestation could have one title or many or more titles. And it also tells you that you can, where you might find the title. And it says a title may consist of a characterizing word or phrase. And there are different types of title of manifestation, which you can see listed there. The toolkit provides a list. We're going to look at the manifestation title proper, but we're going to keep in mind the fact that if we don't choose a title as a title proper, we can still record it as a variant title. The toolkit provides a lot of additional guidance, so you will find that there are instructions on how to do facsimiles and reproductions. This is not, of course. This is an original recording. But there are also instructions on how to record an unstructured description, which is how we have to record the title proper. So there are plenty of there's plenty of guidance on different issues that might arise as you're recording a title. And one of the things the workflow will have to do is to guide people through these. So the one that we're going to choose in this case is looking at, as we know we've got an aggregate, we're going to look at titles of aggregates. And see, because we've got 2 songs on this recording, that means there are two words, 2 expressions. So we're going to look at titles of aggregates. So here's the instructions for title proper. It says, record this element as a value of a nomen entity. So that just means we're in the process of recording the title proper. What we're actually doing is recording a value for a nomen entity. We may or may not actually just create a record for that nomen entity. That will depend on our implementation scenario and our local system and our policies and practices. So the only option for recording title proper, as I said, is recording an unstructured description. So, and it says record the value of manifestation, title of manifestation. So we've already looked at that, so we know what we've got to do effectively. We can use any source of information, and we can record the form found on that source of information. We can also record an unstructured description by transcribing text in spoken word. Well, that's not going to be necessary in this case. But we are going to use the guidelines on normalized transcription. And it's worth bearing in mind that we can also record a note on manifestation regarding the source or the basis of our choice for title proper. So the information that we've got from the resource is that the songs are called Usituma by Monaku. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. And Ragayewo by Tallulah Bakiki. I'm not sure whether I pronounced that correctly either. So we know that the manifestation is an aggregate. We have to record a value that is a collective, we have options to record a value that's a collective title or a value that is not a collective title. And this is where our policies will hopefully help, because our policy statement says record a value that's a collective title. We'll do that if applicable. And then our second policy says, well, if there isn't a collective title, do this, which would record a value that is not a collective title. So there isn't actually a collective title on the resource. And there's a further condition that says, if a collective title does not appear in a source of information, then record a value that is a devised title. And that we would apply if applicable. And there are specific instructions, because this is an archival resource or collection, there are specific instructions on doing a devised title in that context. And it says, record a devised title that includes the name of the creator, collector, or source, if appropriate. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what we're going to take as our devised title, and we're going to record that within our application profile. But I'm also going to record as variant titles the information that was on the cylinder. Now, when the new field for manifestation statement becomes available, I could actually record these as manifestation statements. I could record that whole piece of information as a manifestation statement on title proper and statement of responsibility. But they've not been published in MARC yet, so I can't do that. So I'm just going to record them as variant titles. And you can see that I've recorded 2 variant titles, one transcribed from the resource effectively, and the other one using a variant spelling that comes up in some of Malinowski's work. So yeah, so I need to record the source of that information, so I'm going to add that in a note, just saying it came from the container, and I make it specific to the British Library. And then, so that was the first element. If we move on to look at production statement, this is an unpublished resource, so I'm going to do a production statement. I'm going to cover, and what we know about this is that the recordings were made in 1918 on the Trobriand Islands, which is now part of Papua New Guinea. We might eventually find more specific information about this because research into these resources is ongoing in the communities where they were recorded. So, production statement actually is a super element. It has 3 sub-elements: date of production, name of producer, and place of production. In my application profile, only the date of production is required. So I'm only going to record that one. But there are 2 ways in which I can record it according to my application profile. I can record it as a structured description in the mark 008 field, date 1, and I can obviously record it also as an unstructured description in the 264 field, both of which are required by my my profile. So so looking at date of production now, which was 1918, and we're going to record the element. Again, we're recording this element as a value of another entity, in this case time span, but we don't need to create a record for time span. We can simply record the element in the places that we've already discussed, and it will be a value of time span. So I'm going to record the unstructured description first. So it says the manifestation does not carry a date, which is true, but we do know the year. So we're going to record the year, and we can indicate that the information is taken from a source that's outside the manifestation. And conventionally we do that with square brackets. So there we have it. I've recorded the date of production in 264 field, and I'm now going to add a structured description to record the date of production in the 08 field, and there it goes. And because I know it's a single date, I can put the appropriate code into the position 6 in the 08 field. Much of this will obviously be information that's already in a template in your system, and you won't necessarily have to think about it too hard. However, I still think I need, although I haven't captured the place of production, I still think it's important information. And so I can do that using the capture information option in RDA or element. So again, it's one of these elements that has subtypes, in this case date of capture and place of capture and note on capture. So I'm going to record those values, and I'm going to do that in the 0033 field. So I can record 1918, and I can record Trobriand Islands, Papua New Guinea. We may get more precise information as research continues. And I can make a note that the 033 is obviously good for, relatively good for machine processing, but for display purposes, I'm going to create an unstructured description in a note. It occurred to me that I probably should do an added entry at some point for this, effectively linking it to a place, which I could do in the 752 field in Mark, but I haven't done that yet. So at some point I will get there, but not in this presentation. And then we're moving on to carrier type. So again, we've got some instructions about how to record it and some conditions that we should apply. So if the the condition is that if a manifestation consists of more than one carrier type, do one of these things. And our policy says, well, we can do the first one unless it would be unduly onerous. Well, actually, the condition doesn't actually apply because we've only got one carrier type. But and the carrier type we know is a black wax cylinder. So we can find an appropriate term in RDA, which is the audio cylinder. And we need to record a vocabulary encoding scheme that identifies where we got that term. So that's what I've done here. I've recorded the carrier type as audio cylinder, and I've added the $2 with the RDA registry reference, which is actually slightly different from the reference that's used more conventionally in Mark. This is the official one. And I've also, as I was doing that, recorded the media type because the British Library requires media type to be recorded explicitly. And I've added a note on carrier, which is black wax cylinder. And having done that, we've now got some information that we can use for recording the extent of manifestation, because extent of manifestation is recorded using the number of units and the type of unit, and we're going to use the carrier type to tell us what kind of unit it is. So there's the information. We've got one audio cylinder. Now, in Mark, those of you who are using Mark 21, in the 300 field where the extent is recorded, sometimes duration could be recorded as a sub-unit of extent. But in RDA, duration is a separate entity from extent, and so we're going to record duration explicitly elsewhere. So again, we're recording this element as a value of another entity time span, but again, all we need to do is actually record the information in the appropriate place in our description. We don't need to create an authority record or anything for a time span. We can use abbreviations in this point from the list of abbreviations, which are probably in a different place now from where they were when I did this slide. But anyway, there is a list of abbreviations, and you can see that minutes and also seconds are actually in that list. And there are some specific instructions for aggregating expressions. So you can record the duration of each recording separately, or you can record the overall total duration. And as I don't know, and in fact, the curators who are working on this didn't know either what the individual durations of the recordings were. I'm just recording the total. And I'm going to record that as a structured description in field 306, because there's actually a specific way of recording that information. And there we have it, 2 minutes and 8 seconds. Now, there are lots of attributes that we can go through, but they all effectively go the same process, that we're following whatever instruction RDA offers, and we're putting it into the appropriate mark field in our application profile. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but you're obviously at liberty to watch them at your leisure later. So we have sound characteristics, of which there are there's a long list of things, not all of which we've got information for, and so I'm going to record that in 344, and some of the information can also be duplicated as an identifier in the 007 field. A code like M for mono is actually an identifier, and so we can record that in the 007. I'm going to record an identifier for my item, which in the British Library's case is a shelf mark, which I'm recording there. And I'm going to record content type, which again goes through the same process as we had for media and carrier type. And you can see that we picked perform music, and there it is in the 336 field, which is again required in our application profile. Category of work, I'm going to link out to FAST for this. So category of work is a type to which a work belongs, and there's a helpful gloss saying it's a class or genre. So I want to say that this is a narrative song and that it's a folk song. So I'm going to include those, but while I'm in FAST, I'm also going to look for the category of expression, which is quite a new attribute within RDA, and it's a type to which an expression belongs. So I'm going to treat that in the same way, because this is a field recording, and that's something that I would say is specific to the expression, but wouldn't be applicable to the work, because obviously the song can be sung when nobody records it. We just might not have a record of it. So all of that, you probably couldn't see the detail on that slide, but FAST helpfully tells you where you can record your FAST headings and mark. And so if we go into the 655 field, there is I think a more appropriate field actually for form genre in the 380s, but this is what we're using for the moment. And again, we're recording the source vocabulary. And that's my third heading for field recordings. And because this is, and the other thing that the FAST provides is the actual identifier. So we're going to record the identifier too, which will help us with matching later on and updating perhaps in future. So that's recorded in $0 in mark. Language of expression. So we have some research telling us about the language. RDA tells us to record a notation of term from suitable vocabulary. And that's what we're going to do. We can record it in the 08 field, of course, but we don't have within the mark language codes, there isn't a specific language code for the language that we think this belongs to. So we're going to record a sort of generic group code, which is map. But we can also make an unstructured description to record a term taken from the resource. So I'm going to record details of other information here, which is essentially the information the researchers have provided about identification of this language. And once we know this has been confirmed, we can record it in 041 and specify the source, whether it's ISO 639 or something else like OSLang that we use. Right, I'm just going to move on now to relating the manifestation, which is the next step in the workflow. So RDA only requires works and expressions that are manifested, at least one of them to be recorded. But obviously, the effectiveness of your description is closely related to the relationships it establishes between entities. So we need to provide guidance to people on what they're going to do, and that will vary between institutions. So there's extensive guidance on describing a manifestation in RDA. It tells you that you can relate a manifestation to associated works, expressions, agents, places, and time spans. Now, it says a manifestation that embodies at least one work. If that's the case, and we hope that it is, then you would relate the manifestation to a work that it embodies using work manifested. Alternatively, you can use a note, but our policy would be to make it as explicit as possible. So we're describing a manifestation, in fact, that embodies two or more expressions, because we've got an aggregate. So we need to think about that, because if we're going to eventually want to turn our work manifested heading into a authorized access point for an expression. So again, we've got some policy choices that are options to choose between, and our policy in this case would be to relate the manifestation separately to one or more of the expressions that are aggregated. So the process then is that I will need to create an access point for the work manifested, which is a structured description. I'll be doing an authorized access point because it's going into the bib record, and it's a bib record for a work, the access point for a work. And there are actually specific instructions for musical works. So that's where I'm going to look effectively. And I'm going to record a structured description for that. Now, I can take it from an existing source, like an authority file. If there isn't one in the authority file, I can create one by constructing an access point. BL policy in this is to do what's most appropriate here. I mean, if these things apply, you can do them. So that's the one I'm going to do, the bottom one. And that's the information that we have, of course, from the resource. We're going to record a value that's based on the preferred title of the musical work for the two resources that are, the two works that are manifested here. So the works was, as far as we know, created after 1500. We're going to record a title in the original language by which the work is commonly known, identified through use in manifestations embodying the work or in reference sources. So that's what we're going to do. And so we have effectively two instances of 730 field, one for Usituma and one for Ragayewo, which are our two works. We can then look at qualifying those or helping to identify them more precisely. RDA gives some guidance on musical works. It won't surprise anyone to know that there's quite a lot of guidance on how to do things related to music. But in practice, I'm not going to actually use any of these options because I think it's unnecessary in this instance. So I'm simply going to move on to adding some information about the expression. So I'm going to include a value of the content type and the date of expression, which will help to identify this these expressions. The date is particularly important, obviously, because it will help us to distinguish from other performances. And performed music gives us some context of what the content is. So I'm conscious of time, so I can also relate people such as, so I've actually taken Malinowski from the authority file following the options that RDA provides. and that's his authorized heading there. And again, I can actually, and this time I'm going to include a relationship that says that he's a recordist. Now you can see that the RDA label is recordist person, but the mark relator term is recordist. So at the moment, I'm sticking with that because that's what we've been using for a long time. But I'm also, and this is something that we're looking at writing macros for in our own system, is I'm going to add on the query for the RDA element, so that we've actually got that relationship embedded in that record. Even if we're not going to display it, we'll have it for future use. And I'm going to then do the same for the other contributors to this resource. Again, these ones don't exist on the authority file, so I would create an authority record in those contexts, but I don't have time for that today. So you'll just have to take my word for it. And I want to relate my resource out to another resource, which is a reproduction, which is how we provide access to this, because wax cylinders are very fragile. We don't actually play them because they degrade as they're played. So here's a relationship established using a 787 field with a $I saying electronic reproduction of Malinowski collection cylinder and the record number. No, not really the record number, but a representation of what could be a record number. And so then I get to the point where I can review my resource and say, is my recording valid? Well, you probably can't read it and you probably can't tell from that whether it is or not. But what we're looking at here, obviously, is whether we've got all the elements we need, whether we're linked to authority records, whether we've taken information from the appropriate vocabularies and recorded the source. So that will help us to determine whether our record satisfies minimum requirements, whether it's an effective record, and whether it's coherent description. And so if I just conclude, so RDA obviously is designed to be international and applicable to all content and carrier types. A consequence of that is that there are lots of options, lots of choices that we need to make. So we can constrain those choices using application profiles. These are the choices that the catalogers have to make. We can constrain those to some extent using the application profiles and policy statements so that we meet our own community requirements and satisfy local conditions determined by our systems, etc. And obviously the amount of time that we've got to put into creating an individual record. The workflow will ride across the top of that and provide a narrative layer to guide the cataloger between decision points. So this is the beginning of a process. This isn't what a workflow is going to look like, I hope. This is just the starting point, and both for the workflow and for the application profile. I hope that the narrative made some sense. I know it was very rushed, but our RDA has an underlying very consistent structure which I think we can exploit as we develop these workflows. And one of the challenges I'm trying to wrestle with is how do I integrate policies which are displayed in the toolkit alongside the instructions seamlessly into the workflows as well. So if you want to know more about the RDA toolkit, there's a link to that. But if you're interested in the True Echoes project, which I think is very, very interesting way of working between a national institution which holds material relevant to indigenous peoples on the other side of the world, I do encourage you to have a look at the project page for True Echoes. I think that's it. So I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Alan. That was fascinating, both in terms of the actual object itself and in terms of seeing you work through the application profile. If Gordon joins us, we will get started.